This is your host, Swapnil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFiR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Dormain Drewitz, Vice President of Product and Solutions Marketing at PagerDuty. Dormain, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Swap.
And today, mostly we're going to talk about DevOps interaction with the cloud. But let's just break that. The term DevOps, the evolution, the whole thing, it came with, the cloud, AWS. I talk to a lot of folks, and, as much as we like to say that, like developers, they tend to do a lot of things, but they are still soft silos. There are folks who are specialized in different fields. So if I ask you, we have been talking about this term for a while, how would you define DevOps in today's world? Realistically, not the one that we have bbeen preaching, but something that companies actually practice.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, you can come back to a lot of the great research out of, the Dora group and the metrics that they have found through really intensive statistical studies come back to a lot of very consistent patterns that you can measure. So I like to start there when thinking about DevOps with respect to, having a focused set of activities in order to drive those outcomes, right? That are essentially, how do you deliver higher quality code to production faster and more frequently? And part of that experience is, increasing your lead time to change, increasing your release frequency, improving your mean time to resolution, and lowering your change failure rate. And so mean time to resolution is certainly one that acknowledges that you're never going to get perfect code out there. There are going to be factors, whether it's in the code itself, whether it's new vulnerabilities that are discovered, updates that need to be made, or layers deeper in the stack where you're going to have things beyond your control that ultimately disrupt the ability to deliver the service. So this is also where site reliability engineering is another great sort of set of practices that has emerged that really focuses on that availability, sort of the metric, but really in the context of what is the ultimate business service that you're trying to deliver. And so I think those are important because there's a lot of things that you can talk about, but at the end of the day, what you're measuring is going to define like where your focus is, and so having those metrics established so that you are hitting the availability targets you have, your service level objectives, your mean time to resolution when there are disruptions is really tight. Those are the kinds of things that when you're measuring those things, those are critical to practicing DevOps and site reliability engineering.
Talk a bit about, the role that automation plays to make DevOps lives easier as well.
Absolutely. And you can kind of break it down into two sides where you've got automation that's happening before that release to production, and you have automation that's happening after that release to production. And that can be a useful breakdown in one respect, sort of defining what are the jobs to be done. And in another respect, who is doing those jobs? But I think one thing that's important to keep in mind with automation is it's a big concept. And it's one that's incredibly powerful. As you said, it's ever more essential when you're talking about cloud-based environments and with the increasing complexity that organizations are dealing with in order to deliver those digital experiences. A lot of different interconnected services, reaching out to services that are provided by third parties, microservices that are carving up smaller pieces of code, which have advantages, but then introduce complexity in terms of trying to parse through and understand where exactly a problem might be coming from. But I think when you think about how you get started with automation, something that's important to remember is that you're handing over the keys, right, to the machine to take action for you, which requires a high degree of trust. And so when you're doing that, it's actually really good to start with things that are just remarkably mundane. And so as much as it would be like, oh, it'd be great to automate all of this, the big thing, the reality is it's really difficult to take complex activities and automate them. It's a lot easier to automate smaller activities that have to happen all the time. And that's actually also where you're going to probably get the return on investment from automation, because you're going to be doing it a lot, but it can be sometimes almost hard to spot because they're the little things that are happening day in and day out. So one of the examples we're talking about a lot right now is within that incident response flow. There's a point at which you need to understand and take diagnostics from various systems in order to be able to identify, okay, which system is not behaving as expected. And when you have a first responder, they may have to go tap several different teams on the shoulder in order to understand from the database team, is the database loading data? From the networking team, is something happening from a connectivity perspective? And so on and so forth. And you're usually not even escalating to the app team until tier 2 or tier 3. And so just trying to understand, hey, is this thing on, is not one question to one team, and it may not be something that the person who's initially taking the call either has access to or is trained to do. And so you immediately get very mundane tasks in order to be able to just check, is the thing on? And it suddenly becomes a very expensive proposition. All of them are very short for all those teams, but when you add them all up, what we find is that customers will report to us that half of their time in that mean time to resolution, half of that time is spent just getting diagnostics in order to understand what the problem is. And so that's an area where we've actually been investing a lot to make that even faster for teams to get started with, by looking at a lot of the common components, whether they're AWS services or Kubernetes or Linux, Nginx, some of the most popular components out there, and we've pre-built jobs so that they're very easy for folks to be able to take that, automate the step of just checking, check the status of the EC2 instance, pull the syslog from the Linux container, all of those types of things. They're almost like painfully mundane, but those are exactly the kinds of things that you want to be able to automate and do it well, because they're going to come up again and again.
If I ask you, once again, as much as we like to break down the silos, there are still, silos within the companies. There are developers, there are DevOps teams, there are security teams, SREs, depending on, the badges or label that we can, slap on them. When we look at automation, whose problem, or who is kind of supposed to automate things? And I would also love to hear, how PagerDuty kind of make it easier for them, so that once again, developers especially, they should be focusing on writing the business application, not a lot of, as you said, mundane things.
What we're seeing right now is that developers have so much that they're trying to stay on the cutting edge for, just to be able to do what their primary function is, which is to write that business logic that's driving the business forward. So increasingly we see that there are teams, maybe not directly the infrastructure teams, but not directly development teams. So sometimes referred to as platform teams. They run the tool chains that developers use, and they provide that rising of the tide that's going to lift all the boats across those development teams. And that's really where there's a great focus and concentration around automation. And again, you can think of it as that sort of before the deployment to production. So those tool chain teams that are doing a lot of automation in order to speed up how you deliver to production. And then you have the sort of steps after production, right? After something's been deployed, now how are you making sure that it's healthy and safe in that production environment? So your site reliability engineering teams are very focused here. And a big part of what those teams spend their time on is, sure, we're going to help fix the problem, but we also want to make sure that we're never having to fix the same problem again. And so how are we automating and constantly looking to automate any of those steps that have been along the path to resolving an issue in production, so that or reaching even further to the left, as they say, into the development cycle in order to be able to catch something earlier in that pre-production stage, but again, with an automation mindset. So there are absolutely things that development teams can be doing to automate. I think it might be even more providing sort of the instructions and some of the metadata around their code so that other teams can really be driving the automation into those production environments. For an example, something there that I was hearing from a customer was just the restart. How does this piece of code, this application, get restarted? It sounds, again, painfully mundane, but it's the kind of thing that's going to come up again and again and again in a production environment is, well, if something's not working, have you tried turning it off and turning it on again? And so if you don't have the instructions to be able to turn it back on, that's going to be more painful. It's going to involve taking away time from the development team. If you have those instructions, that then becomes the runbook that you can automate.
If you can share, what kind of tools are there that kind of makes their lives easier, just like a glimpse of the tools that, hey, these are the things that are there, which they can leverage so that once again, these mundane tasks, they should not really become, a big challenge for the whole team.
Again, because automation is such a big word, there are a lot of different tools available that are often focused on automating specific parts of the problem, right? So your CI and CD pipeline tools are absolutely providing critical automation in that path to production. And so that's something that we certainly integrate with in order to be able to take signal from. We want to understand those change events because they can often be correlated with incidents further down the line in production. And there's other steps. Those CI/CD pipelines might be kind of orchestrating that particular process, but there may be steps within that have to reach into another environment and provide some additional automation. So there, with our process automation tools, which is built on Rundeck, open source Rundeck, if you're familiar with that. There, we've seen folks who've basically taken 30 minutes off of their time to production. And when you multiply that across 500 production deployments a month, you're saving a couple hundred hours of engineering time. And so you also have things like your configuration management, right? So tools like Ansible, Chef, and Puppet out there looking at configuration. But then you have to think about who really has the keys to run those. And so how can you democratize being able to access those automation scripts with a governance model so that you don't have to expose configuration to something that's really important to keep secure. And so how do you allow different teams to be able to take steps and actions that then reach into one of those configuration management tools, which are providing a level of automation in the environment. But if that needs to get pulled into a broader workflow, a process automation is something that would provide governance around some deeper level of automation.
When you're talking about these tools and we look at, just cloud native, now cloud native can be seen as a thing or a process or the way of doing things, especially when we look at Kubernetes. So things are getting complicated very quickly. I hear from a lot of customers, a lot of users that now it's kind of becoming a pain point for them. The challenge is that there are a lot of players who are offering solutions, but you also have to maintain the balance between the flexibility of being able to leverage what Kubernetes ecosystem has to offer versus getting a fully opinionated solution there. So talk a bit about when we do look at all this complexity, either you say developers' life or DevOps life or SRE life, their lives are becoming really, earlier it was just, hey, when it's Christmas or New Year, then developers have to panic or sweat. Now it's year long. So talk a bit about that complexity and also how, once again, not a whole catalog that CNCF has to offer that companies can use, but how, to just make it easier for them. We can also look at just, what PagerDuty is doing in this regard.
I think, Kubernetes is a great example of a really powerful orchestration engine that is providing a level of automation, right? It's going to be automating and reconciling back to a configuration that you've provided, and it will automatically reconcile back to that state that you have declared. Let it be so. I want my system in this state, and there are some inherent actions that are taken. So I talked about, can you restart the thing? And what are the instructions and steps to restart a system? Kubernetes is going to assume that system can be restarted and is going to take that action for you. And so this is where we've certainly seen some great learnings from the community there around, if your system is really slow to restart and there's multiple components, you can run into an issue where you get into a sort of circular crash because it's waiting on another system. So you have to be really thoughtful about how each of your systems that are interdependent on each other are prepared to restart. And so that's some refactoring work that you potentially have to look at before you put something into Kubernetes. But as a precursor to that, because the minority of workloads right now are in a system like Kubernetes. Most code out there is going to be running in something else, something heritage, if you will. And there, what are the steps that you can take to start to get some of those benefits, even if you're not ready to do a full refactor? Can you at least write down the instructions to be able to hand it over to an automation system to automate that process, run that run book on the team's behalf? So that's kind of an example where we live in this world where we have cloud native tools that take those steps, but we also have all of our heritage code out there that we still have to manage. And then, even within your Kubernetes environment, we talked about diagnostic steps. And so, how do you automate the steps even in that diagnostic process to be able to understand what's the state of things in that Kubernetes cluster? And how do you make it so that you don't have to hand over the keys to every Kubernetes cluster to anyone who's on call? You can have a governance model around how those diagnostics can be pulled in a secure way, but be made available for someone who's taking an on-call rotation. But they're the developers, they own the code, they don't own the Kubernetes cluster that it's running in, but they may want to be able to get some information back from Kubernetes in order to be able to understand and rule out the source of the issue. So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but those are just some things that come to mind in terms of both the baby steps and the reality of, we don't live 100% in any of these worlds, as well as, again, how do you come back to those painfully mundane steps and make those a little bit easier, because they're kind of the death by 1,000 cuts that a lot of teams struggle with, and that is what frees up the time to be able to take on the more interesting challenges.
We have been talking about automation for a long time. How much awareness do you see is already there, in the industry regarding automation? There are a couple of things that are happening right now. First of all, we just saw Uber case a few days ago, which was a totally different thing. We would not expect something at that level, but it was there because of this post-COVID world recession. Cost is becoming a very big factor. Companies are looking at either cutting costs or becoming more efficient. So when we look at automation, how much do you see awareness for the perspective of, hey, there is this return on investment when we do apply this, or you still have to educate folks that, hey, you should embrace these kind of practices?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's something that on the one hand, there's a lot of awareness and desire for it. But I think a lot of folks sometimes struggle with how to figure out what is that next step to take. And to your point, what is the business case, the business justification in order to take on that work? Because it's not, you don't get automation for free. It is work that has to be done in order to define and really make sure that you're because of that trust that's required when you're handing over the sort of the keys of a process to a system, you want to really trust that it's doing it the right way. So you don't get that for free, but the payoff is, as I've heard from some of our folks in the field, is what customers are calling the workforce multiplier. And so if I can't hire anyone else, whether it's just because of lack of budget or challenges in recruiting. We've got the budget, we just can't fill the role. We've seen customers essentially almost create like a persona that is the automation that is taking on that work for the team. And just like you would have to onboard a new member of the team, you have to onboard your automation member of the team. I think we even saw a customer give it a name. I can't remember the name. I wish I did. And so, this is like another person on the team. You do have to make that investment, but then you get that payoff. And I think I heard a great way of it described, where you might be investing $10,000 in that first automation, both in terms of the time, tooling, etc. But and the first time you run it, it cost $10,000. But the 500th time that automation ran, it cost $20. And if it gets used another 500 times, it cuts in half, right? So you get this economic scale out of that investment. Whereas if you never took that step, that cost is just going to be growing linearly with however often that action, that step, that process has to run. And if you're trying to do more with less or more with the same even, you have to start thinking in terms of where am I going to get that leverage over time? And so, again, coming back to what are those painfully mundane things, the things we might hand off. If we just had that junior person on the team, they could do it for us. Well, think about how is automation that junior person on the team, and how are you going to onboard that person and get that value and that economics over time.
I think I have covered most of what I was looking for in today's discussion, but if there is anything else that you feel, hey, Swapnil, we should have talked about that as well, I'm more than happy to cover as well.
There's some of the big things to just shift people's perspective on is remembering to start small. The things that happen a lot, small things that don't happen very often aren't really worth it, but small things that happen a lot are probably the places to start. And it doesn't really matter whether you're kind of cloud native or dealing with a lot of legacy. There's probably opportunities in there. They just might take a different shape. And then thinking about the practical realities of implementing automation, who does it have to touch? A lot of engineers are, they'll tell you, sure, I automated that. I wrote a script for it. Who else can run that script? It's usually like, oh, I haven't thought about that. I can do it, or my immediate team can do it, but no one else in the organization is able to take advantage of that automation. So how do you expose that safely to other teams so that they can start to take steps? Another thing here is thinking about customer service teams that are also on the front lines when there's an incident happening. And what steps are they able to take just to be able to validate that the customer is having an issue? That's an example of, how do you empower another team to be able to take steps? So I think that's where thinking about the value of that automation, you're going to hit those 500 runs a lot faster when you also include other teams.
Dormain, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about this consistently evolving topic. I really appreciate your insights there, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.